Hello and welcome back. Today is the third and final video about the Isaiah chapters of Second Nephi, or the fourth and final if we count the Second Nephi chapters 6 through 8. And we're going to cover Second Nephi chapters 21 through 24, and it will be relatively short. Something interesting that I discovered while researching Isaiah is that most of the websites or online information sources about the geography of Isaiah's day were created by members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Perhaps that's an indicator that church members are making an effort to understand him. Before we move into today's material, we need to answer our trivia question from last time. And it will actually be relevant for today's discussion. Who conquered the Babylonians? The short answer is the Persians, led by King Cyrus. We talked about them in First Nephi. The Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem in roughly 587 BC and carried its people away captive. Several decades later, the Persians conquered Babylon and not only allowed the people of Judah to return to Jerusalem, but funded the rebuilding of their temple. Now we move into today's discussion. As we read Isaiah, it's worth considering whether Isaiah's prophecies were limited to the very specific period in history when he was alive, or if his words describe eternal patterns. For example, in our last discussion, the Assyrian king was an instrument in God's hands, destroying the wicked. He didn't know he was acting on God's errand. He simply wanted to conquer and expand. Then he advanced on Jerusalem and God's chosen people, and his destroying Jerusalem seemed unavoidable. But then, nearly all the soldiers in the Assyrian army suddenly died overnight, 185,000 of them, and the king returned to Babylon. Was that an isolated incident, or is that a type of event or pattern that we see recurring, either on a national scale or a personal scale? Are we, or will we be, nationally or personally or spiritually threatened with destruction and then saved at the last minute? Something to think about. So here's a roadmap of what we're going to cover today. In chapter 21, Isaiah describes conditions during the reign of the Messiah. Chapter 22 is a song of praise and gratitude to the Lord for his salvation. Chapter 23 foretells the destruction of Babylon as judgment from God. And chapter 24 describes the fall of the king of Babylon and addresses his arrogance and his pride. Beginning with chapter 21, Isaiah describes conditions after the king of Assyria has been destroyed during the millennium when the Messiah reigns over the earth. There will be no violence. Bears and cows will eat together. Children will play with snakes unharmed, and so on. I wonder how much of that is symbolic, or if kids really will like playing with snakes. They don't seem too much right now. Interestingly, both Christian and Jewish commentators agreed that this chapter was about the Messiah's future millennial reign. Toward the end of the chapter, the Lord begins to gather his people. Here's verse 11. And it shall come to pass in that day that the Lord shall set his hand again the second time to recover the remnant of his people, which shall be left from Assyria, and from Egypt, and from Pathros, and from Cush, and from Elam, and from Shinar, and from Hamath, and from the islands of the sea. The Lord will raise an ensign, or a banner, to signal to the world that he is gathering his people. Verse 12, and he shall set up an ensign for the nations, and shall assemble the outcasts of Israel, and gather together the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth. Then we move to chapter 22. Chapter 22 is a hymn of praise, and it's only 6 verses long. Here's verse 2. Behold, my God is my salvation. I will trust and not be afraid, for the Lord Jehovah is my strength and my song. He has also become my salvation. And here's verses 5 and 6. Sing unto the Lord, for he hath done excellent things. This is known in all the earth. Cry out and shout, thou inhabitant of Zion, for great is the Holy One of Israel in the midst of thee. Chapter 23 is another hymn, and it discusses the destruction of Babylon. I spent some time looking into the great city of Babylon, which today is nothing more than a collection of ruins 59 miles southwest of modern-day Baghdad in Iraq. It began as a small town on the Euphrates River around 2300 BC, and this is reportedly where the Tower of Babel was built. It's also where the Jaredites began their story. During the reign of the ruler Hammurabi, around 1800 BC, it became a major city and less than a century later, it was the largest city on earth. Over the next several centuries, Babylon prospered, was conquered, prospered again, and was conquered again. By 100 BC, nothing remained of the city but ruins, and that's how it is today. The Great Fall of Babylon, discussed in the Bible, occurred around 539 BC when the city was taken by Cyrus, king of Persia, which appears to be what this chapter is about. Most of this chapter consists of poetic imagery about the destruction and suffering of Babylon. Here are a couple of verses as an example. Behold, the day of the Lord cometh, cruel both with wrath and fierce anger, to lay the land desolate, and he shall destroy the sinners thereof out of it. Verse 10, for the stars of heaven and the constellations thereof shall not give their light. The sun shall be darkened in his going forth, and the moon shall not cause her light to shine. Isaiah concludes the chapter with these verses, describing the utter ruin of Babylon. And Babylon, the glory of kingdoms, the beauty of the Chaldeans' excellency, shall be as when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. It shall never be inhabited, neither shall it be dwelled in from generation to generation. Neither shall the Arabian pitch tent there, neither shall the shepherds make their fold there. And so it is. The once great city of Babylon is now nothing more than abandoned ruins in Iraq. Chapter 24 says that the Lord will have mercy on Jacob, or Israel, and then he describes the leader of Babylon. Or is he describing Satan? You decide. But first, God eventually did have mercy on his people, as we discussed in the trivia question. Babylon was conquered by Persia, and the captive people of Israel returned to their land and rebuilt their temple. Here's verse 1. For the Lord will have mercy on Jacob, and will yet choose Israel, and set them in their own land, and the stranger shall be joined with them, and they shall cleave to the house of Jacob. Then the rest of chapter 24 is a poem about the fall of the Babylonian king. The tone is of rejoicing and celebration, and Israel essentially does an end zone dance over the fallen ruler. But, as seems to be the case with most of Isaiah, although he was speaking about the Babylonian king's future destruction, his prophecy could just as readily apply to the eventual defeat of Satan. Here's verse 12. How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning? Art thou cut down to the ground, which did weaken the nations? For thou hast said in thy heart, I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will sit also upon the mount of the congregation in the sides of the north. I will ascend upon the heights of the clouds. I will be like the Most High. Yet thou shalt be brought down to hell, to the sides of the pit. They that see thee shall narrowly look upon thee, and shall consider thee, and shall say, Is this the man that made the earth to tremble, and did shake kingdoms, and made the world as a wilderness, and destroyed the cities thereof, and opened not the house of his prisoners? And on this note of celebrating the defeat of evil, we end the Isaiah portion of Second Nephi. Now that we're done with the Isaiah chapters, Nephi said back in chapter 11 that he included Isaiah's words because they testified of Christ. Now that we've finished the Isaiah chapters, have we seen that? If so, how? The first few chapters talked about the Lord's people straying from the covenant path, and then when things went badly, thinking that God had abandoned them. Isaiah was called to be a prophet. Commanded by God, he tried to help his people navigate the political threats of the day, but the leaders wouldn't listen to him. Isaiah prophesied of the virgin birth of Emmanuel. He warned of the Assyrian invasion. He described a last-minute rescue from the invaders, followed by a time of peace. He also prophesied of the humiliation and destruction of Babylon and its king. Do those things testify of Christ? Nephi felt that they did. And in our next discussion, we'll talk about why. So if you're not signed up yet, go ahead and subscribe. But now we're going to end with a trivia question. In 1 Nephi, the Liahona played an important role as Lehi and his family traveled to the Promised Land. When is the last time we hear of the Liahona being used? It will be mentioned a few more times in the Book of Mormon, but when is the last recorded incident of the Liahona or compass being used? That's all we have for today. Until next time.